Every great dynasty has a ghost, a forgotten hero whose exploits laid the foundation for glory. For the first NHL dynasty, that ghost was Jack Darragh. He was a silent assassin who scored golden goals to win 3 Stanley Cups, a hometown hero, a gentleman warrior. And then, at the height of his power, he disappeared, taken away by a cruel twist of fate at just 33 years old. His story is more than a personal tragedy. It is a journey into the brutal origins of the NHL, a forgotten era of the game, and a haunting reminder of how easily a hero's legacy can fade. To understand the man, you must first understand the city that forged him. Ottawa, at the turn of the 20th century. This was not yet the polished, stately capital city of modern Canada. This was a rough-and-tumble lumber town, a place of muddy streets, sprawling timber yards, and the constant, thundering noise of logs floating down the Ottawa River. It was a city of hard-working, hard-living Irish and French-Canadian immigrants, a place defined by its brutally cold winters, where the Rideau Canal would freeze solid for months on end, transforming the city's central waterway into a vast, natural hockey rink. In this Ottawa, hockey was more than a pastime. It was an obsession, a shared language, the very heartbeat of the city. It was the city's passion, its obsession, its primary source of civic pride. The Ottawa Hockey Club, known colloquially as the Senators, were more than just a sports team. They were a civic institution, the city's champions in a young and fiercely competitive nation. This was the world that John Proctor Darragh was born into in 1890. He grew up in the shadow of the local arenas, his childhood soundtrack the crack of a wooden stick hitting a frozen rubber puck. He was a product of his environment, a quiet, unassuming boy who possessed a fierce competitive fire and a preternatural talent for the game. He rose through the ranks of the city's famed amateur hockey system, a crucible that produced some of the greatest players of the era. He starred for the Ottawa Cliffsides, a local team, and quickly gained a reputation as a skilled, intelligent, and most importantly, versatile player. In an era of increasing specialization, Darragh could do it all. He was a natural right-winger, but he could also play rover, the now extinct 7th position on the ice, a hybrid of a forward and a defenseman who was expected to be everywhere at once. He was a fluid skater, a smart passer, and he possessed a hard, accurate shot. He wasn't the fastest player on the ice, nor the biggest, but he had an intangible quality, a kind of hockey sense that could not be taught. He saw the game in a way that others did not. By 1910, at the age of 20, he was ready for the big leagues. He was signed by his hometown team, the Ottawa Senators of the National Hockey Association, or NHA, the precursor to the NHL. It was the dream of every Ottawa boy fulfilled. He was not an immediate superstar. For his first few seasons, he was a solid, reliable role player on a team loaded with future Hall of Famers. He was learning, watching, and patiently waiting for his moment. The world of professional hockey in the 1910s was a brutal one. The game was played with a level of violence that would be shocking to modern eyes. There were no helmets, the protective equipment was rudimentary, and the rules were loose. It was a game of attrition, a test of will as much as skill. And in 1917, this already tough world was thrown into a state of chaos. The NHA collapsed under the weight of internal disputes, and in its place, a new league was born, the National Hockey League. The Ottawa Senators were one of the founding members, and Jack Darragh was there from the very beginning. It was in the new 4-team NHL that Darragh truly began to blossom. Now a seasoned veteran in his late 20s, he emerged as one of the team's offensive leaders. But it was his performance when the games mattered most, in the crucible of the Stanley Cup playoffs, that would define his legend. The first great chapter of that legend was written in the spring of 1920. The Senators, as NHL champions, were set to face the champions of the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, the Seattle Metropolitans, for the Stanley Cup. It was a series that was almost undone by the weather. The games were played in Ottawa, on natural ice, and an unseasonable spring thaw turned the rink into a lake of slush and standing water. The conditions were so terrible that in a move that would be unthinkable today, the final games of the Stanley Cup final were moved to an artificial ice rink in Toronto. It was in this chaotic, nomadic series that Jack Darragh ascended to the level of a superstar. In the fifth and deciding game, with the Stanley Cup on the line, he played the game of his life. He was an unstoppable force, a man possessed. He scored a hat-trick, accounting for 3 of his team's 6 goals. And his third goal, the one that sealed the victory, was a moment that would be burned into the memory of every fan who was there. He took a pass, skated in on the Seattle goaltender, and with a calm, deliberate precision, he fired the puck into the back of the net. The Stanley Cup belonged to Ottawa, and Jack Darragh, the quiet kid from the streets of Ottawa, was the hero. The series was a brutal, back-and-forth affair, a battle of attrition that tested the limits of both teams' endurance. By the time the fifth and deciding game arrived, the players were exhausted, bruised, and running on fumes. The game was a tense, defensive struggle, a chess match on ice where a single mistake could mean the difference between glory and defeat. For 2 periods, the teams battled to a 1-1 tie. The tension in the arena was unbearable. The championship, the culmination of an entire season of work, hung in the balance, waiting for a hero. And once again, that hero was Jack Darragh. Early in the third period, he took a pass, flew down the right wing, and unleashed a hard, low shot that beat the Vancouver goaltender. 2-1, Ottawa. The arena exploded. For the rest of the period, the Senators clung to that slim lead, weathering a furious Vancouver assault. And as the final seconds ticked off the clock, it was Jack Darragh who had once again scored the Stanley Cup winning goal. In fact, he had scored both of Ottawa's goals in that deciding game. In the 2 most important games of his career, in back-to-back seasons, with the championship on the line, he had been the difference maker. He had earned a new nickname, one that would stick with him forever. Mr. Clutch. He was at the absolute peak of the hockey world, a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, the hero of his hometown, and one of the most respected players in the game. And then, in a move that shocked the entire hockey world, he retired. Just a few months after his legendary performance in the 1921 final, at the age of just 31, he announced he was hanging up his skates. The official reason given was a vague illness. He had been suffering from severe abdominal pains, and doctors had advised him to quit the grueling physical game. For the fans in Ottawa, it was an incomprehensible loss. Their hero, at the very height of his powers, was walking away. This mysterious illness is a crucial and often overlooked part of his story. In hindsight, it was the first shadow of the tragedy that was to come. He spent the next year away from the game, focusing on his health and his off-season job as an accountant for a local dairy. But the Senators and the city of Ottawa needed him. Without their clutch leader, the team struggled, and so, after a year in retirement, the call went out. His former teammates, the team's management, even the fans, begged him to come back for one more run. His health had seemingly improved, and the pull of the game, the lure of chasing another championship with his friends, was too strong to resist. In 1922, Jack Darragh returned to the Ottawa Senators. It was as if he had never left. He stepped back onto the ice and immediately reassumed his role as a key player and a quiet leader. And that season, he led them on another incredible journey. For the 3rd time in 4 years, the Ottawa Senators won the Stanley Cup. The comeback was complete. The hero had returned, and he had delivered another championship to his beloved hometown. He would go on to win a fourth Stanley Cup with the team in 1924, cementing the Senators as the first true dynasty of the National Hockey League. Jack Darragh, the quiet man from Ottawa, was a four-time champion, a living legend. But the man behind the legend was not a mythic figure. He was a quiet, humble, and deeply devoted family man. In an era when many athletes were known for their carousing, Darragh was a homebody. He was married, with a young son, and his life off the ice was one of quiet domesticity. He was a gentleman, universally respected by his opponents for his clean but tough play, and adored by his teammates for his loyalty and his calm, steady presence. He was the antithesis of the modern, flashy sports star. He played for the love of the game, for the pride of his city, and for the camaraderie of the locker room. There are no great, boastful quotes from Jack Darragh. There are only the quiet, consistent actions of a man of immense character. There are no real controversies in the life of Jack Darragh. The only debate is a historical one. Why is this clutch, four-time champion, this foundational star of the NHL, not as famous as some of his contemporaries? The answer, perhaps, lies in his own quiet nature, his humility, and in the tragic, shocking suddenness of his death. He was not a self-promoter. He was a man who let his actions and the score sheet in the biggest of games speak for him. And just as the hockey world was beginning to truly appreciate the full measure of his greatness, his story was cut tragically short. If the 1920 Stanley Cup final was the moment Jack Darragh became a hero, the 1921 final was the moment he was forged into myth. The Ottawa Senators, once again the champions of the National Hockey League, found themselves in a grueling 5-game war against the champions of the West, the Vancouver Millionaires. The Millionaires were a powerhouse team, led by the legendary Cyclone Taylor, a whirlwind of speed and skill, and they pushed the Senators to the absolute brink of their physical and emotional endurance. The series was a brutal, back-and-forth affair, a battle of attrition that tested the limits of both teams. By the time the fifth and deciding game arrived in Vancouver, the players were exhausted, bruised, and running on little more than raw nerve and civic pride. The game itself was a tense defensive struggle, a chess match on ice where a single mistake could mean the difference between glory and a long, silent train ride home. For 2 periods, the teams battled to a 1-1 tie, the air in the arena thick with a tension you could almost taste. The championship, the culmination of an entire season of sacrifice and labour, hung in the balance, waiting for a hero to step out of the stalemate and claim it. And once again, that hero was Jack Darragh. Early in the 3rd period, with the game locked in a suffocating embrace, he took a pass from his longtime teammate Eddie Gerard, flew down the right wing and unleashed a hard, low shot that beat the Vancouver goaltender. 2-1, Ottawa. The arena fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the cheers of the few Ottawa faithful who had made the cross-country journey. For the rest of the period, the Senators clung to that slim lead, weathering a furious, desperate Vancouver assault. And as the final seconds ticked off the clock, it was Jack Darragh who had once again scored the Stanley Cup winning goal. In fact, he had scored both of Ottawa's goals in that deciding game. In the 2 most important games of his career, in back-to-back seasons, with the championship hanging by a thread, he had been the difference maker. He had earned a new nickname, one that would stick with him forever, Mr. Clutch. He was at the absolute peak of the hockey world, a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, the hero of his hometown, and one of the most respected players in the game. And then, in a move that shocked and bewildered the entire hockey world, he retired. Just a few months after his legendary performance in the 1921 final, at the age of just 31, he announced he was hanging up his skates. The official reason given to the press was a vague but persistent illness. He had been suffering from severe abdominal pains throughout the season, a quiet, internal battle that stood in stark contrast to the public, physical warfare of the hockey rink. Doctors had advised him to quit the grueling, punishing game. For the fans in Ottawa, the news was an incomprehensible loss. Headlines in the Ottawa Citizen lamented the departure of the city's quiet champion. The team's management was in a state of panic. Their hero, at the very height of his powers, was walking away. This mysterious illness is a crucial and often overlooked chapter in his story. In hindsight, it was a dark and tragic premonition, a shadow cast by a fate that was already gathering on the horizon. For a man who seemed so indestructible on the ice, this admission of physical vulnerability was a profound and humanizing moment. He spent the next full season away from the game, but he did not fade into a life of quiet convalescence. In a move that was perfectly in character, he simply went back to work. He returned to his off-season job as an accountant for a local dairy, trading his hockey sweater for a ledger book, the roar of the crowd for the quiet clinking of milk bottles. He was a champion, but he was also a working man, a man whose identity was not solely defined by the game he played. He was, once again, just Jack Darragh from Ottawa, but the Ottawa Senators and the city they represented needed him. The 1921-22 season was a struggle. Without their clutch leader, their quiet heart, the team seemed to lose its way. They were still a good team, but they were missing the intangible spark, the calm, steady presence that Darragh provided. They finished second in the league, but were eliminated in the NHL final by the Toronto St. Pats. The city felt the loss keenly, and so, after a year in retirement, the call went out. His former teammates, the team's owner Tommy Gorman, even the fans, begged him to come back for one more run. His health had seemingly improved, the mysterious pains had subsided, and the pull of the game, the lure of chasing another championship with his friends and for his city, was too strong to resist. In the fall of 1922, Jack Darragh returned to the Ottawa Senators. It was as if he had never left. He stepped back onto the ice and immediately reassumed his role as a key player and a quiet leader. He was no longer the team's primary offensive weapon, that role now falling to younger stars like Cy Denny and Frank Niber. But his veteran savvy, his defensive responsibility, and his uncanny knack for being in the right place at the right time were as sharp as ever. And that season, he led them on another incredible journey. The 1923 Stanley Cup playoffs were a grueling multi-stage affair, a true test of a champion. First, the Senators had to defeat their bitter rivals, the Montreal Canadiens, to win the NHL championship. Then, they had to travel across the continent to face the champions of the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, the Vancouver Maroons. After defeating them, they had to turn around and face yet another champion, the Edmonton Eskimos of the Western Canada Hockey League. It was a marathon of punishing, high-stakes hockey, and through it all, Darragh was a steadying force. In the final, brutal series against Edmonton, it was his veteran leadership and timely scoring that helped push the exhausted Senators over the top. The comeback was complete. The hero had returned, and he had delivered another championship to his beloved hometown. Jack Darragh was now a 3-time Stanley Cup champion. He played one more full season, in 1923-24. The Senators, the aging dynasty, made one last valiant run. They won the NHL title again but fell in the Stanley Cup final to the Vancouver Maroons. It was the end of an era, the last gasp of the league's first great dynasty. But Darragh's status was secure. He was an icon, a living legend. But the man behind the legend was not a mythic figure. He was a quiet, humble, and deeply devoted family man. In an era when many professional athletes were known for their carousing and their larger-than-life personalities, Darragh was a homebody. He was married to his beloved wife, Elizabeth, with a young son named John, and his life off the ice was one of quiet domesticity. He was a gentleman, universally respected by his opponents for his clean but tough play, and adored by his teammates for his loyalty and his calm, steady presence. There are no great, boastful quotes from Jack Darragh. There are only the quiet, consistent actions of a man of immense character. There are no real controversies in the life of Jack Darragh. The only debate is a historical one. Why is this clutch, three-time champion, this foundational star of the NHL, not as famous as some of his contemporaries? The answer, perhaps, lies in his own quiet nature, his humility, and in the tragic, shocking suddenness of his death. He was not a self-promoter. He was a man who let his actions, and the score sheet in the biggest of games, speak for him. And just as the hockey world was beginning to truly appreciate the full measure of his greatness, just as he was settling into his role as a revered elder statesman of the game, his voice was silenced forever. The end came with a terrifying and brutal swiftness. In June of 1924, just a few months after his final season had ended, the city of Ottawa was settling into the warm, peaceful days of early summer. Jack Darragh, his wife, Elizabeth, and their young son were returning from a drive in the country. That evening, he began to complain of severe stomach pains. It was initially dismissed as a simple, if unpleasant, case of food poisoning. But as the night wore on, the pain intensified, becoming an agony he could not bear. A doctor was called, but the situation was dire. The diagnosis was not food poisoning. It was a ruptured appendix, and a virulent, fast-acting infection, peritonitis, was now raging through his body. In the pre-antibiotic era of the 1920s, peritonitis was often a death sentence. It was a terrifyingly common and often fatal outcome for what is today a routine surgical procedure. An emergency operation was performed, a desperate last-ditch effort to save his life. But it was too late. The infection was too advanced, the damage irreparable. For a few days, the city of Ottawa held its breath, reading the grim updates in the newspaper, praying for a miracle for their hero. But this was one battle that even Jack Darragh could not win. On June 21st, 1924, just a few weeks shy of his 34th birthday, he passed away. The news of his death plunged the city of Ottawa into a state of profound shock and mourning. It was incomprehensible. How could this happen? How could a man who was a professional athlete, a picture of health and vitality, be struck down so suddenly by such a common ailment? The city that had cheered his goals now wept for his loss. His funeral was a massive public event. Businesses closed their doors in a sign of respect. Thousands of ordinary citizens from all walks of life lined the streets of the funeral procession to pay their last respects to the quiet man who had brought them so much joy. The entire hockey world descended on the city. His teammates, the men he had gone to battle with, served as his pallbearers, their faces etched with a grief that went beyond the loss of a great player. They had lost a brother. The Ottawa Senators, the dynasty he had helped to build, would win one more Stanley Cup in 1927. But the heart of the team was gone. The quiet, reliable presence that had guided them through so many battles was no more. In the years that followed, the memory of Jack Darragh was kept alive by those who had seen him play. He was posthumously inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1962, a long overdue recognition of his greatness. But as the years turned into decades, and as the black and white era of hockey gave way to the colour television and the global expansion of the modern NHL, his name began to fade. He became a statistic in a record book, a footnote in the story of a long-gone dynasty. His legacy is more than just a collection of statistics and forgotten championships. He represents a bygone era of the sport, a time when players were deeply connected to their communities, when loyalty to a single city was a sacred bond. He was the ultimate hometown hero, a man who was born in Ottawa, who learned to play on its frozen rivers, who brought glory to his city, and who is buried in its soil. His story is a snapshot of a time when the game was played for something more than just money. It was played for pride, for community, for the love of the game itself. It is a heartbreaking reminder of the fragility of life, a story of a champion who was taken at the very peak of his powers. He was a quiet star from a silent film era of hockey, a humble man who rose to the occasion when the stakes were highest. His name is etched on the Stanley Cup 3 times, but his true legacy is that of the quiet hero who played for his city, won for his city, and was mourned by his city. And in the history of the game he helped to build, that is a legacy that will never truly fade away.